Welcome everyone, Greg Stewart with Mazek Seeds. Happy to have you with us today for our Power Planter Preparation Session. We're here at Cloverleaf Farms near Bell River, Ontario, owned and operated by Morris and Rob Papineau. They've been gracious to let us come into their shop today to talk planter setup and maintenance. And we're joined by Sean Dilliot, sort of our guru of planter performance. And he's joining with us here today to talk about getting the last things fixed and ready to go for planting 2021. We're going to start right here at the heart of the beast and do some discussion around maintenance of the row unit itself. So I know, Sean, you've got some opinion as to what needs to be done in the shop versus what needs to be done in the field. Why don't you get us started on that idea?
Definitely in the shop, you want to be doing at least 80% of what we're going to call planter setup. And lots of times when we go and do a field visit on a person, for a person that is having trouble in the field, we find that there's some stuff that should have been done under what most people call maintenance, and we simply can't adjust to override that. And it could be anything from some electrical problems, blade wear, down pressure not set up properly. It can be a lot of different things. Those are the type of things that in the shop, if you set it up right when you go to the field, it will be a lot easier to set up. Setup in a field should not take very long. Setup in the shop should take a long time. So always remember, it should be at least 80% of your maintenance and your prep, your setup, if you want to call it that, should be done in the shop or outside if your planter can't fit in the shop, but it should be done ahead of time. So one of the big things we run into every single year is the row unit. People think that they've done the maintenance, and the very first thing and the most important question that I get from everybody, at least they think it's the most important question, is when do I change my seed blades? And they think that once they've addressed that seed blade, they're done. Everything's good. To address a seed blade question, most makes start with a 15-inch blade. And you want to measure it with the blade off. Everybody tries to cheat and go around the hub. You cannot do that. You have to take the blade off and measure it. This blade measures 14 and 13/16. And the cutoff is 14.5, so it's barely starting to wear. And so that blade's in good shape, but we've taken it off, we haven't estimated it, we now know that it's good. One of the problems we're running into for quite a few years now is a lot of these rows have multiple wear items on there. This, the coulter blade, anybody with a coulter blade, the seed blade and the inside scraper all need to be changed at the same time. If this blade is showing that you're at 14.5 or close to it, and you've got some acreage to do, or you're below it, you need to change this blade, and the inside scraper. No ifs, ands, or buts. Because I've seen more service calls having to be done because we changed this, a few years later we changed that, now everything's out of whack and the planter won't go in the ground properly and it's not putting the seed where it should be. We're not getting seed to soil contact. So always make sure you change all three together. Now, if you only have a trash wheel out here, of course, you don't have to do much to it except just make sure that the wheels are turning freely, the bearings are good, it's adjusted properly, all that kind of thing. Adjustment on a coulter, where should it be, Greg?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was going to ask you. We traditionally have spent a fair bit of time making sure that the coulter is shallow, that is above the bottom of where the double discs are going to create your trench.
Yeah, I've heard lots of different measurements over the years. My favorite, my opinion only, 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch. And we need it done on a flat surface on the ground. And every year I get that person saying to me, but my planter's 40 feet wide. I don't own a cement pad that I can get to it that's level, that's 40 feet. Not a problem. Put the planter down in the yard, get a piece of flat stock, lay it underneath. Please don't use wood because it digs in. So just get a piece of flat stock steel that's 6 inches wide and use that. Just make sure it's a good thick piece that doesn't flex. But you want to make sure that this blade is 1/4 to 3/8 inch above the other. If you do that when the blades are new, you're probably never going to adjust it again. They seem to wear pretty evenly.
Yep.
So check it every year though.
I think to that point, Sean, I think particularly down here where Bell River, there's some, how should we say, some fairly firm soils here.
There's some firm soils.
That it becomes particularly important that coulter not run deep. If you go to Oxford County and you're in some beautiful, I'm not so sure that where that coulter is positioned is nearly as important as running ground like the Papineaus run here, where you don't want to be mucking into that heavier ground with a coulter running too deep.
I agree. And in some of that prime dirt, when it will really be important then is when it gets too dry, when they're going in extremely dry conditions, because we don't want to pull that dirt out. Coulter type is really important too. Know your coulters, talk to people that know. This is a good all-around coulter. This is a 3 by 13 or a 3/4 by 13 coulter. It's good for all different soil types. Whereas if we go to a 24 wave, please don't use that in lighter soils. It's only for heavier ground. There's some coulter blades I have absolutely no use for because they're designed to actually throw the dirt out of the trench. Not sure why we want to put them on planters. But make sure that you adjust this properly and make sure that this inside scraper, and every brand has it, gets changed when you change the seed blades. And that's another no ifs, ands, or buts. Okay? Make sure your seed tube isn't broke. Sometimes when you don't change the bottom scraper, you will break the hook off your seed tube and your seed tube will be there flopping away. We can talk about Ketons for a minute. Ketons, when do you replace them, Greg?
Yeah, sometimes we talk about, when they're not at least 2 inches thick at the back or some sort of measurement. Sometimes people replace them when they feel there isn't significant down pressure on them. I'm interested in your opinion.
Well, when we assemble these and adjust them, I do not want a lot of pressure on them. I find that when we see problems in the field, and again, this is an opinion, but when we see problems in the field, a lot of times there's too much pressure on it. And if you get in dry conditions and you're wondering why you can't the seed doesn't seem to be where it should be, sometimes if you're planting shallow especially, we see it in white beans, we see it in sugar beets, if you're trying to plant and you've got too much force on this and you're trying to plant shallow, the seed will go around the keton. And then in those conditions, we tell people to either back it off or take the keton out for the year. Okay, but in most conditions in corn and soybeans, we just want enough pressure to keep it down to the bottom. And there are people out there that sell springs to make them really hammer them into the ground. And again, that's an opinion thing. But when you've taken as many off as I have because there's too much pressure, then that's what you should do. Now, if you happen to be one of those gentlemen that got to a corner and backed the planter up with it too low and bent them all and twisted them, get rid of them, because if they're not following perfectly in the trench, they'll actually rifle the seed out of the trench. So in those cases, definitely get rid of them.
Perhaps misalignment is more of a problem with the keton than wear or down pressure.
It can be. I have seen planters where every single keton on the planter is damaged. So get rid of those. Okay?
Okay, Sean, we're going to talk about pinch point on these double disc openers. And I see you don't have business cards in your hand, so how on earth are you going to do that discussion?
I'm one of the few people that believe in paper, not business cards, because you find me 2 business cards that are the same thickness. They're all different thicknesses. Are they too thick, too thin? Paper is the same. We found that in today's measurements, being smaller, paper works better, it's more accurate. I would really recommend paper over that.
Cool.
And for the person that doesn't do this, when we were at the other end of the planter, we talked about making sure that everything was checked. This particular planter, we already verified that the blades are in really good shape. The front coulter blades are adjusted right. So now we want to check the pinch point. And this again should be done in the wintertime, because if you have to change this, now this particular planter has a couple years on it, I believe, since it was done. So we don't know whether it's going to be accurate or not. And just simply insert the paper in from that direction with a straight edge, insert it in from this direction. And with today's thicker blades, we want between 1 and 1.5 inches. And as you can see, it's absolutely perfect. If I can stay above that inch, The higher I can go to get towards that 1.5, the better your V is going to be. And at 1.5, we really don't have a true V anymore, by the way. It is a bit of a W. So the closer you get to that 1.5, the better. Do you know why we're doing 1.5 and not the old measurement, which I'm not even going to say?
I think it's because the blades are thicker and they can't handle that much deflection to create a 2.5-inch pinch point?
Correct. So what it is we've never had a roller bearing ever in history made for side load. Tapered bearings are for side load. So as soon as we went to the thicker blade, it puts too much side load on that bearing and takes the roller bearing out instantly. In fact, the year that we had the blades go thicker, the manufacturers didn't bother to tell us that we needed to close this up a little bit, and we took bearings out like crazy. If you're taking a lot of bearings out, make sure that that pinch point is not too wide.
Right.
Because it does create a lot of pressure on that. So. Gauge wheels. You had some questions about gauge wheels.
Well, we had some discussion in our agronomy sessions this winter. Missy Bauer from Michigan talked a little bit on planter setup, and she said one of her prime concerns is when depth gauge wheels are not adjusted correctly and they're not pinching up against the double disc blade, that dry soil tends to come off the soil surface and sort of rooster tail up the back of the disc and end up in the furrow. So what is the right adjustment on those depth gauge wheels? Well,
first of all, I totally agree with that. I have seen that many times. The adjustment should be so that where that wheel meets the blade, it should be just nicely touching. Now, the old measurement was they wanted you to spin that tire and that blade should spin. And that's fine for some of the older row units. But what we found was because of the design and the gauge wheel being on an angle, it was pinching in too hard and peeling the edge off prematurely on gauge wheels. So you're always going to get, the gauge wheel is always going to suck itself in a little bit. So what we want is we want it just nicely touching. On this particular row unit, it's not touching at all up here because the manufacturer put a little more angle on it, and it actually works nicer in the field, and we are touching at the soil contact. So now we don't get that premature wear from being up here, but we've stopped that soil from going in the furrow. And I have seen exactly what you're talking about. And you're wondering why you've got dry soil down with the seed, and yet when you dig up the soil normally, it's just nice moisture down there. So
right.
it does rooster tail around and go in. But the gauge wheels, there's so many different gauge wheels on the market now. We talked about that a few minutes ago. Narrow, wide, that's a preference. Okay, there is really, if you've adjusted them properly and they're in good shape, there really isn't any bad ones out there, I don't think. That's my belief. But one thing I will tell you, as soon as a gauge wheel has a split in it, get rid of it, because it fills with dirt and it doesn't function the same, especially where the split was. It will ride differently 180 degrees from the split, and they don't work right, and they will not last.
And I guess back to your earlier comments, that's preparation that has to clearly be done in the shop before you get to the field to test whether that pinch point is good and whether your gauge wheel is tight against the disc, at least at that one spot soil contact was.
Soil contact part. And that brings you up a good point of cuts on the side too. If your wheel is got chunks missing out of it, you're not going to get that good blade contact, and you are going to end up with some dry dirt in the furrow. Again, it's not something you want to be doing on May 10th when you're trying to put the last of the corn in, or even the first of the corn.
Right.
You know, you want to make sure that all of that is done ahead of time.
Sean, we could spend maybe the entire session talking about closing wheels. Give us your best 3 minutes on closing wheels, the art and the science.
There's a lot of do's and don'ts. The biggest thing is you need to check your closing wheel alignment. Doesn't matter what closing wheel you choose, make sure it's aligned. Almost every single manufacturer out there right now has a way to align the tailstock and the closing wheels. The people that don't have an adjustment up here, a lot of them use spacers on the wheels, so there's lots of ways to get that pinching right centered over the row. We want it nicely on each side. It's up to you, depending on the type of wheel that you use, it's up to you to determine how much of a spread you want. I know myself, I don't like them too tight because you're going to be constantly pinching on top of the row. But if you get it too far away, you're not doing anything either. The only true way to adjust the alignment is, and this has been a never-ending topic for 30 or 40 years since this style of row unit came out, is when can you adjust it? When do you think you can adjust it, Greg?
Well, I usually drive on the driveway and then get back around and try to see whether my closing wheels are centered over top of the double disc opener mark. Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm often maybe working by myself, and you don't have someone maybe guiding you enough. I don't know.
Yeah, I tend to tell people don't do anything on a driveway, and that's because you'll find that a row unit will actually go around gravel and things like that. It works really well if you've got a big lawn that you don't mind cutting up a little bit, because now with some of the big yards we do, best thing is in the field. Make sure you concentrate on just putting that planter as slow as it'll go in the field, perfectly straight, and to take it for a little bit of a distance, then go back and just simply look. And make sure that you adjust them right, and make sure you double check them and triple check them, because just because you moved it over, if you go a little ways, it works better. Definitely easier with people, because two people, because one person can be driving slow and you can actually walk across and look at them, because they do change a little bit, believe it or not, when you're following, even if the person in the tractor is perfectly straight. So on this particular unit, you just simply loosen these up, and these are eccentric, and turn them to adjust it. So one of the big topics of discussion in the last few years, when I started in this business 30 some years ago, there was one closing wheel for this style of row unit, and that was this one. It's still around today. Now, I would estimate there's 30 to 40 minimum. Everybody's got a go-to. I got a go-to. I particularly still like the rubber in most cases. If you like cast, that's good. Just don't go to cast so you can plant 3 days earlier. And a lot of people do in heavy ground. I'm going to go to cast because whenever I go to plant, I'm not closing my trench up because it's a little too sticky. That's not the reason to go to cast. The reason to go to cast is seed to soil contact, but let's not do it so that we can plant 3 days earlier. I'm a fan of certain ones on the market. There's a lot of small plastic spikes out right now that are really nice. A shorter, what we're going to call a knob spike. My particular opinion is I do not like long cast spikes. I find too many times I've had to get farmers to take them off because they're disturbing the seed. The old rubber ones, there's some curved tines out there that I really like. And most of the time we just put 1 and 1. So don't be afraid to experiment. And the best way to experiment with closing wheels is to put your end couple rows, 2 or 3 rows, with your new combination and try it. Now you have, if you do 2 rows, you now have 4 rows when you turn around, and that will show up. So you don't have to do the whole planter. Play around a little bit. Okay.
What about chains? Chains on the back.
Oh, that's a bad topic. I'm going to tell you every time, throw them in the garbage.
Throw them in the garbage.
That's my opinion. What's your opinion?
I have some good feelings about chains on the back. I'm using the plastic knob closing wheels.
Yep.
And it just seems like a chain dragged over that closing wheel combination gives me a little bit more soil dragged into the trench.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've been to so many fields where the chains were used and then we got a small rain and it sealed off very, very hard because you brought a lot of fines into that. The other thing is, on a planter like this, I definitely don't recommend it, because we've seen more than one person that thought they were going to clear everything, and when they folded the planter up, they ripped the row unit off.
That's a downside.
That is a big downside. Yeah, so I'm not a chain fan for a whole bunch of reasons. That particularly is one of them, but I've seen too many times where we're bringing fines in. Got in a big discussion a few years ago at a clinic about it, and almost every person there that was into the business of walking fields did not like the chains for the reason of the fines and the rain. So
Sean, we generally have focused, and I think most of us focus on the row unit. talk to us a little bit about other things outside of the row unit that haunt us in terms of good field prep.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Greg. When you're dealing with the farmers in the spring and they have some of these problems come up, a lot of times it's things that should have been caught under the maintenance, under the setup in the shops or in the off season. Frame is a big issue. Make sure all the grease fittings take grease. Almost any of the big planters, if they won't grease at the flex points, we can pinpoint where they're going to crack ahead of time. They need to be greased. We need to make sure there are no cracks. The only way to really check for that is with a flashlight. The naked eye really can't see it. As soon as you use a flashlight, they show right up. Electrics, it doesn't matter whether you've got all the newest, fanciest stuff, you still got to get those wires away from pinch points. You got to make sure that they're wire tied properly. Do not use white wire ties, use black wire ties because they're UV resistant. Make sure you double check everything. Make sure there's no wear points on your hoses. Those are the things that put planters down for typically a day to 2 to 3 days, depending on how bad the issue is in the spring. And then the person says, well, I never thought of checking that. So check everything over. Spend that extra day checking everything over. Make sure you've checked the frame. Make sure you've checked the electronics. Make sure you've checked all the wiring. Make sure you've checked all the hoses. And just double check that everything functions and works. And hook the tractor up to it ahead of time. Make sure it sees the monitor. Make sure it sees the row shutoffs. Make sure all that kind of stuff is working ahead of time. It's a big point that gets missed probably more than anything else.
Too much focus on the row units, not enough on the frame and the rest of the setup.
Too much focus on the row unit and too much on the meters maybe, and yeah.
Good.
Okay.
Yeah. So Sean, we should talk at least for a couple of minutes on the metering units themselves. Give us your top concern or top problem with finger units, with vacuum systems, with brush meters. Can you throw at us your number one issue on those 3 ideas?
Sure. Finger pickups, the number one problem is not getting them tested. If you get them tested from a reputable tester, they're probably going to have precision fingers in them and precision backing plates with an adjustable brush. So it should be done. There is no other system on the market that will perform like that will. The next biggest problem with those meters is the people that don't adjust the brush. Every single lot of seed, you should be adjusting the brush. There's charts out there that are good, tells you where to do it. Be diligent, get them tested, follow the recommendations. You will be very happy with them. If you don't, you won't. Vacuum meters, get them looked at. If you're not capable of looking at them and seeing the problems, then you need to go to a reputable dealer and get them checked. Look for seal damage, look for cracks on vacuums, make sure there's no buildup. There's no meter on the market that should be cleaned with air. Maybe dust from a distance, but do not clean out brushes and stuff like that, whether it's a vacuum or a finger pickup or a brush meter. Do not clean with high-powered air. You will destroy the brushes. So that is one of the things we see in both vacuum and brush meters and finger pickups. So make sure you clean them out, but make sure they get checked. And check your plates that they're not wore. Check your plates that the holes haven't gone elongated because of kickers and stuff like that. Brush meters, we could spend days on brush meters. Make sure you change the brushes, make sure you check the steel wear strips. If your meter is old enough, it doesn't have a stainless steel wear strip in it. There are some dealers around that know how to install those retro. You need a special jig to do it. Make sure that gets done. Replace those brushes, they're cheap. And make sure you use graphite, graphite, graphite. And same with a finger pickup. I don't care who tells you what, graphite is the only thing you should be using in there as a standard starting point. When we started getting into problems with humidity and sticky seed, that's when we add the talc. We never take the graphite away. Graphite is a lubricant. Those are friction meters. They need to have that in there. And we're actually seeing, I prefer to see graphite used in seed drills and in central fills and everything else. We find that the seed just moves freer, everything works better, and then we use the talc to address the issue of moisture. Okay, so don't be afraid to use them both.
Thanks, Sean. Okay, Sean, we've moved outside for you to give us the quick lesson on getting things ready to roll in the field.
So when we get to the field, the very first thing we want to check, whether it's a new to you planter or whether it's your old faithful, is check to make sure that that planter frame is parallel to the ground. Gone are the days of worrying about the tongue. Gone are the days of saying level to the earth, you know, with all the rolling ground and everything else. We want that frame parallel to the ground. Some makes, the parallel arms are not straight, they're angled a little bit, so try to concentrate on that frame. Make sure it's parallel. That should be your first adjustment, because that affects every other adjustment on the planter. So do that first, okay? That's the very first thing we're going to do. Once that's done, what do you think we should do next?
Yeah, go to the back.
Go to the back. Work your way from the front to the back. Very first thing on a rear row unit is down pressure. So that's the next thing we want to check. You've leveled the planter, you've gone down the field a little ways. By the way, should we be doing this with the planter cranked right full?
Good question.
About a quarter full, especially if it's a new to you planter, because anybody can make seed go in the ground with a planter that's loaded to the hilt with fertilizer and everything else. Try to do it, if you've got time, do it ahead of time, do it with about a quarter full. But go back, go another 150 feet, stop the planter, leave it in the ground, go back, check your gauge wheels. Are they pushing dirt, or can you spin them freely? If you can spin them freely, you don't have enough down pressure. So, you know, and don't be afraid when you're figuring out down pressure, especially if you're no-tilling soybeans with a planter like this with a lot of row units, do the math. Because if you've got 400-pound springs on there and you've got a max because the ground is hard, does your planter weigh that much? For every pound you've got of up force, which is down force, you've got to have that weight to hold that planter in the ground. So if you get a dry spring where your planter is coming out and you can never adjust the depth and your gauge wheels are always spinning, check your total up your weight. If you've got 24 rows and they're 400-pound springs, you need that much weight to push that planter down into the ground. So do the math quickly in your head too, especially if you start adjusting depth and it doesn't respond. So once we adjust the down pressure and we're happy with that, then you can check the seed depth. And the seed depth is always the very first thing everybody wants to check, but it shouldn't be the first thing you check. So once you adjust that down or that depth now, because you've leveled the planter and you've got the proper downforce, you'll get a response. It will adjust. Most planters that don't have infinite adjust are about 1/4 of an inch. Would you not agree with that statement?
Yeah. Yep.
But there are makes out there that are infinite, and those are nice because you can get between those settings. Then the next thing you should be doing is your closing wheels, okay? Make sure that they're set properly, make sure their down pressure is set properly. A lot of people never check the down pressure on those closing wheels, but they should be doing that. So then what we want you to do is, what would you do next as an agronomist?
I would dig for seed.
Yep, and I would check the population. So in 30-inch rows, if you're planting corn, you need to dig 17 feet 5 inches and see how many seeds are there. If you have 32 seeds there, you have 32,000 population. So check that. Most people we can't get to go out and dig and to measure that. They say they can't find the seed. My go-to trick has always been, go to the hardware store, get yourself a piece of dog chain or use a bungee strap, put the closing wheels up, shallow that row up to about 1/4 inch, and then plant for 50 feet, go back, you'll find all the seed, and then just close it over, you know. So
yeah, handy thing to have, a piece of chain with a couple of S-hooks.
Yep.
Get that tailstock up out of the way, shallow up that row, and then if you plant 50 feet, you can walk along and do a reasonable job of counting those seeds.
You should be pretty accurate if you do that. And that's one of the big things we see is people really don't know what they're planting. They're just hoping their monitor is right. So that's one of the big things. And on most planters, if you're planting along and all of a sudden your population goes crazy, first thing you should be checking is your speed on that monitor, because speed is the calculation that determines the population. So if you planted for 3 days and everything was good, and all of a sudden your population either goes away and you don't have it anymore, or it goes wonky, check and see if your speed on your monitor is jumping around. That's your calculator for that. So always get a lot of phone calls on that. So, but in field, be diligent, dig, make sure you followed all the steps. Start at the front, go to the back, and be very careful and take your time. We tell people, I've told people for years with a brand new planter, figure the first day you're going to do between 5 and 20 acres. Because if you do that and get it set right, the next day you're going to plant more than you ever dreamed of.
Okay, hey Sean, that's been great. We've gone over, in a bit of a hurry, but we've gone over the key setup and maintenance issues. We're gonna take the next 15 to 45 minutes and get some questions coming in from the people that have watched the session, and we'll try to do a Q&A and fine-tune maybe some of the queries that we're gonna have coming in from the guys that have been watching the webinar. But thanks for your time today.
No problem. Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Mazex.
All right, so Steve Denise here, brand director with Mazex, and joined by Sean Delliott and Greg Stewart. Excellent overview on the planter. Just a reminder to everybody, if you've got questions you want to ask Sean or Greg, please put them in the question box, which is should be on the right-hand side of the webinar screen that you're looking at. So that was a really good overview. Some things just to follow up on perhaps, and some questions coming in, Sean. Is there anything maintenance-wise, you know, if you talked about down pressure, but if you've got a hydraulic down pressure system or airbags, what should we be doing there from a regular maintenance perspective?
Airbags, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so airbags, one of the big things is check for leaks. You know, if you own a planter with airbags or an air system on it, you should have a spray bottle with some dish soap in it always, because when you lose your air or when you start to have a problem, you need to be able to find it right away. So on those systems in the shop in the wintertime or off season, charge them up, let them sit. A lot of times letting them sit overnight and seeing if they hold the pressure, if the bags are still got the same pressure in the morning, that's good. Some people say, well, they never hold. Try to figure out how many leaks you have, fix them one by one. You still should at least be able to be close in the morning. But the only way to really find leaks with those is that. One of the biggest problems with airbags is leaving that planter out in the sun. Detrimental to it. Those bags will not last. They wear bad enough as it is. You put them in the sun, they're going to wear 2 to 3 times faster. So if you're that person that parks that in the outside for 2 or 3 months till you get it cleaned up, I wouldn't. I'd get it inside, get it under shade. The hydraulic ones, you really want to be careful that you take good care of it. Check over your rubs for the hoses. Lots of times it's kind of an afterthought because they're not lifting the planter with it or anything else, but those hoses go from row to row. They need to be kept out of pinch points. And almost every, in fact, I think every single hydraulic system out there does have self-check or what we call health checks. So you should be doing that ahead of time and making sure that everything is visible, making sure the rows go up and down, making sure the pressure varies. Big thing is make sure those, your weigh bars, your waypoints on each row function. Make sure there's none of them that your diagnostics are telling you are bad. Make sure if you've got one that's bothering ahead of time, sometimes just get rid of it. Just because it's only going to cause you grief in the field.
It's probably not a bad idea, like weight pins and that, to keep a couple on hand just when you're in the middle of the season. So what,
Always.
question tire pressure then. You know, what's just maintenance on tire pressure, and then I'll add to that, Sean. So there's tire pressure on your planter tires, and if you've got a drive tire for like a liquid pump or something. But what about bearings and checking bearings on your main tires too?
Yeah, every single bearing should be checked on the planter. Jack those up, adjust them. A lot of the makes now, you don't have to tear them apart to adjust the bearing. Free play, we'll call it. A lot of them have either double nuts on them or set screws on the locking nut, and you can adjust them without tearing them apart now, which is really nice. I prefer to have a grease fitting on every single tire. That's an off-season job. Some people say, well, why don't the manufacturers put them in? Well, because they just simply don't all the time. But you're always a lot better if you put grease fittings in those hubs and do it yourself if they don't come with it. But definitely check those bearings. On some of these planters, it's a massive amount of weight. We are seeing failures for the people that don't check the free play and don't grease them. And then that's usually, to give you an example, on the two biggest manufacturers, you're looking at well over $1,000 if you ruin the hub and the rim. So, which is usually what happens.
Yeah, and it's usually on the day you don't want it to happen. So that's the
always in. Yeah, it doesn't happen on a rainy day.
Hey, Sean, I got a question here. I got a question here on closing wheels. We had a nice little chat about closing wheels, but this question coming in is about whether the closing wheels should be directly across from each other or whether the closing wheels should be offset. Got an opinion on that one?
Yep, standard practice is we offset them in heavier trash, or if you've got the small baseball size stones and below, the ones that'll wedge in there, if you stagger them, they will flow through better. Root balls will flow through better. Sometimes in a spring where you're using a lot of trash in a wheat stubble field, we'll see it even bother there a little bit. And so you can stagger them in that case. It is a personal preference thing. Myself, if I'm not running in heavy trash or stones, I personally like the opposing. I've walked a lot of fields, and I feel that especially in clay, you get a better seed to soil contact, but it's an opinion thing. So again, like we talked about trying different closing wheels, do one end of the planter one way and one end of the planter the other way, and see what you're happier with. Lots of people, I say, you know, well, something about you're not getting seed to soil contact, and they say, and I'll say, why didn't you put them opposing? Well, that's the way the planter came. I bought it this way. Well, just because you bought it that way doesn't mean it should stay that way. That is an actual infield adjustment you can do. You know, and lots of times we do it. I think of where that person is and what their farming practices is, and then I make a judgment call on that, or tell them what I think they should start with. But definitely try 2 or 3 rows different if you're not happy with the job it's doing. But no trash, no stones. I prefer opposing. Just my opinion.
Yeah, I'm with you on the stone thing. That the advantage of offsetting those closing wheels, especially if you're playing with a bunch of different styles of closing wheels, is that some of those closing wheels will catch a stone, and the odds of that happening is much less if you've offset them a bit, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned
Hey,
trash.
Sean, we also didn't talk about parallel linkage. You want to give us just a few comments on checking parallel linkage and wear points?
Yeah, if you've got a planter that's gone over quite a few acres, we did mean to do that, and we both forgot. You need to go to the back of the row unit. The easiest way to explain it is on a rear row unit, and you're not trying to lift the whole row unit up. You're just trying to tip the back. And if you can tip that back up and down very much, you've got probably bushing wear, and you could have wear in your arms. There's lots of tricks out there. I've had lots of people tell me, I went to the machinist and I got bearings put in them, and I've done this and I've done that. And that's all great if you're improving it. But I also have seen people spend thousands of dollars on some of those tricks and not be any farther ahead. Most of the manufacturers offer good replacement parts and bushings. Some of them wear more than others, and be careful of the cost. people don't think about that when they buy a planter, and some planters can be as much as $800 to replace the arms and the bushings, and other planters are $180. So there's a big difference between planter makes and planter parts pricing. So just be careful of that if you're buying an older planter that has a lot of wear in it.
You mentioned trash, Sean, and a question here from Jean-Luc on trash cleaners and how you feel, if they're important. What conditions do they make the most sense? Does it make most sense corn after corn? What about corn after soybeans? Maybe some comments on that.
What was the question again?
Trash cleaners on the front of the row unit.
Trash.
Yeah, and then what you feel, and where's the best conditions to use those?
Definitely for the higher trash people. The other thing is I've seen them work really well in clay when we get a tough spring and there's a little bit of chunking, and if you set them so they're just going to kick the chunks away and whatever trash is there. I do like the trash wheels. If you're one of those people that likes the comfort of that colder out front, just for those hard spots on that, there's a lot of good combos on the market, residue combos. But the biggest thing with any trash wheel is don't move too much dirt. If you look back and they're turning 100% of the time, and you're not in that heavy of trash, you've got them set too aggressive. Because always remember, if you move away an inch of dirt and you get a big sideways rain, that inch of dirt is coming back. But be careful too, if you're in stones or certain makes that are a little bit light. There's a few floating ones that don't really float, and when they kick up, they break the mounts. So do a little bit of research, figure out where you're at. None of them should totally float. You should always set the bottom depth on them. And what that stops is the kicking action of them going up and down and then breaking the mounts. And a lot of people think that floating means that they can float them downward as well as upward. Well, we like them to go up, but just make sure that the minimum depth is set, because we don't want them digging in, and that's when you'll see them go down the field and start to porpoise back and forth, and that's what breaks stuff. Okay.
I am prepared. I'm prepared, Sean, to give up on closing wheels unless they've got automatic control on them.
Closing wheels?
No. Sorry. Trash wheels.
Oh, yeah. That the automatic ones are unbelievable. I have to admit, quite a few years ago, we were putting a set on, and I thought this is totally ridiculous. And we went out into a field, and I was blown away by what they could do. I will say though that I've seen some systems that are saying that they're automatic, and they're not. They're either all the way up or all the way down. We can't seem to set the air pressure to them. There's a couple hydraulic ones, one in particular, that work absolutely phenomenal. There is some really good automatic ones on the market. I will totally agree with that. But there are a couple out there, and again, do your research. There's a couple out there that I have not seen that they're very easy to adjust in the field. Okay.
Yeah, fair enough.
Got a question here from Steve on closing wheel downforce. And he's always been told that if you can't dig it up with your finger in terms of seed, then you have too much downforce. Any comments on that?
I totally agree with that statement. I know in clay sometimes that's a little bit tough to do, but also if it's fit, I've been in fields before where the farmer took a screwdriver, dug out a 4-inch chunk square, broke it all apart, found the seed, and said, "See, perfect." Not really too perfect. I always tell people, if I'm in your field and I'm digging away the seed and I can't get to it, and I pull the keys out of my pocket to dig it up, you've probably got too much downforce on your closing wheels. Not a big fan of having them wedged into the ground. And like I said before, I'm not a big fan of using closing wheels to close wet soil, because if you can't dig it up, how's it supposed to dig through? How's the seed supposed to grow?
Got a question from Dave here. Are electric drives worth the investment, and do they last?
yes, we haven't seen any real problems with them, especially if you're one of those people that take care of them. About 5 years ago, I predicted within 10 years, every manufacturer on the market would be electric. I think that they've beat me to that. I think, if I'm not mistaken, almost every major manufacturer, there's probably about 4 or 5 offers an electric version now. So we didn't even make the 10 years. If you're investing in a new planter, think very, very serious about it. What an electric meter does is it gives you a row shutoff for your ends for overlap and variable rate. And most of them are variable rate individual rows. And that might not be that important to you, but I talked to the seed corn boys around Chatham, and that, you know what that's like, Steve. You can set one row for different population. I mean, it's certainly nice, but we've seen no major problem with, or I've seen no major problem with electric meters. I'm a big fan of them. It's nice to get rid of that drive line, I will tell you that, because a lot of times you've got bearing issues that you don't even know it. And I'm telling people now, when you're trying to figure out why you have a throb in your drive line, you're pretty well to the point these days where you got to pull the shafts, because you may be able to turn it over easy with a wrench, but if you pull the shafts, there's probably one bearing in there that's locked right up, and that's what you're getting a pulsing on your drive shafts. Totally eliminates that. I've picked a lot of seed corn in my life, and I can tell when I pull in a field if they used electric meters. It's that good. It's just consistent. Okay.
What about setting air pressure? So setting air pressures with different seed sizes and that on air planters. What are some of the common things you've seen or common areas for improvement we need to look at?
Understand how the meter works. A lot of the newer systems, and I call them the premier vacuum meters, they're all up in that 17 to 22 range. Most of the time they're going to run 19, 20. If you're still an old school meter where you're running 8 to 10 PSI, or not PSI, but inches of vacuum, think about upgrading that meter. An example is a John Deere meter that still, you're still running in that 10 to 12 range. If you put a precision ESET in it, you basically turn that into a modern type meter. You're going to run 20. You're going to have a lot less adjusting problems, and you're going to be more consistent. You'll gain a couple points, percentage points of drop right away as it is, especially with tough ones. But if you're planting and you've been planting along and you're planting at 0.5 skips and 0.5 doubles, or at least when you dig, if you don't have a monitor like that and you're happy with it, and your population's at 32,000, which is what you've got it set for, and you switch varieties and the population goes down to 29.5, you've got a problem. So know how that meter works. Odds are you don't have enough vacuum for a larger seed, or it's not a consistent seed. Don't forget, shape is as important as size, and so is, we saw a big issue a few years back with test weight. When all the seed had a low test weight, we had an awful time trying to make it plant with certain vacuum meters. So understand how the vacuum works. Be able to talk to your dealer when you do have a problem. They should be able to guide you through, taking hundreds and hundreds of phone calls on that issue. And any good dealer that knows how their meter works can guide you when that does fall off. But definitely it's a variety to variety issue. And if you understand what putting the vacuum up or down will be, or the blower pressure in the case of a white planter, and then also understanding if your meter has a singulator on it, understand that also. And check the meter, because if all of a sudden it changed, we saw it one year where one variety had the tips of the corn breaking off, and it was plugging the discs. And then the longer they planted, the worse it got, because the tips were in there. And some manufacturers make an ejector for that. So just take a look at the meter.
Very good. And just on that note,
we talked about toolbar, leveling the toolbar. I got a question here about toolbar height. Do you get concerned about where your toolbar is positioned in terms of inches from the ground, or is it all just about being level with the ground?
No, the toolbar is so important. Every different make has a different height. If your toolbar is too high, you're not putting down pressure on those springs or on the airbags if you have them. A hydraulic one will compensate to some degree because it's using the weigh bars, but the bar height is really important. Every make is a little bit different. Some makes you're not going to get to where the book says. It's virtually impossible. Not sure why they put that height where they put it in certain makes in the book, but it's virtually impossible. Know your planner. If it changed from one year to the other, what is holding it up? What, we've seen it as simple as an attachment on the front of the row unit binding the planner. The person says, I was at a service call once and the person said, the planner would go down last year. Why doesn't it go down this year? I said, what did you change? Always go to that. What was the last thing you changed? And he said, well, we put these on the front of the row unit. We look underneath and they're just stopping it from going down. Took them off and the planner went right down. So sometimes it's something goofy. Sometimes it's you have a hydraulic issue. It's not phasing properly. And understand how your planner levels. A lot of times when somebody purchases a phasing planner and they get planning, the first day is fine, second day so-so, third day they can't get it even close to being level. And they didn't realize that they have to phase that planner. Some planners are in the down position, most are to phase them. There is one make out there that actually has an up phase, which is a cultivator phase, not a planner phase, because everybody's used to phasing them in the down position. So understand what you have. And some planners, you have to mechanically put them into phase to level them up. So know what you have, read your books.
Good.
Just to follow up on the level thing is what, for your row units, what do you find is the easiest thing to do in the field to make sure that you've got those level?
Check that frame. Just make sure it's parallel to the ground and level. Most of the planners out there that aren't level will be tongue low, which is bad because if you think about it, your seed tube comes down on an angle like that. So if you tip it back, you're now rifling the seed partway up the trench. If you can't quite get the adjustment perfect on your hitch, err on the side of being the front high, not the front low. Again, I've heard all the stories of the bottom of the tongue and the seed can and everything else. The tried and in today's world with these big planters, the best way is to make sure that frame is parallel and at the proper height, like Greg talked about.
Just a quick reminder, I just want to go back a minute, is when we talked about air pressures and settings, Mazex actually every year we do extensive testing on all the seed size, different lots that we produce, and that's under our seed right recommendations. And so we can give an ideal air pressure, a brush setting for our different seed sizes by hybrid. Just ask your Mazex seeds dealer for that. So when planting in conventional conditions, this is a question from Walt, should you leave the planter in constant detent hydraulic down pressure or put it in float?
I would need to know the make. There's not a lot anymore that are floated. If you have an older John Deere 7000, definitely leave it in float, especially if it's a modular. If you're running a new, let's say a new Kinsey 3600, should never be in float. That's detrimental.
Yeah, most planners, Kinsey 3500 with an 8/16 setup.
It should never be in float, ever. It should power the planter down, leave it down. It's probably going from a planter like a 7000 to anything modern. We want the cylinders phased properly. We want everything. We want that planter frame pressured down. Once it gets down, go back to neutral. Don't float it. The older ones, yes, you can float them. Some of the older
questions on brush meters. When we're using brush meters on soybeans, we've got a lot of folks using those still. What's your thought? Is there an ideal planting speed with brush meters?
We have not found that brush meters are affected by speed very much. I haven't found that. I've done testing where I've gone up to 10 mile an hour on the test, and they don't affect it a lot. I don't recommend it because of bounce. It's the row unit that bounces them the most. If you're using it properly, I did some testing for a dealer or a grower a couple of years ago that had to plant 400,000 because of bad germ on a small seed lot, and we didn't see any downside of planting for 100,000 at 5 mile an hour, which is the same as 200,000 at 10. It's all in RPM. So again, always go back to ground conditions and everything else. We don't really recommend you start planting. If you don't own a high-speed planter, don't plant high-speed. That's general statement.
Question from Jason. What's your opinion on going from smooth to spiked or notch closing disc? So you talked about this previously when you were at the planter. What's your opinion from going from smooth to spiked or notch closing discs on the early riser case planters for managing dry soil seedbed type conditions on a clay?
Never on, and this is on the closing wheel system, getting rid of the single one, I take it. And yeah, I've never been in a field in my life where I had, I'm stuttering because I'm trying to be politically correct here, but when you have a cast closing wheel with long steel spikes, you shouldn't. And I've never been in a field yet where I said, oh, is that ever doing a good job? I like the short spikes that we're getting now. There's the plastic ones you talked about, Greg, are available in cast now, and they work really well. But as soon as you get into a long spike, you're disturbing the soil. And, you know, and you might be able to show me a case where you're not, but I've seen too many times where they've purchased it for one reason or another, and then we got to take them all off and go find the rubber ones that they threw in the corner of the shop and hope that they're all there. The on the case early risers, that row unit was designed with the closing system, with the closing discs on there to do it that way. I guess one of my opinions is if you're switching away from that, why did you buy a case? But because it works really well, it works excellent. But if you're trying to close in tougher conditions, that row unit will struggle a little bit, and you're going to spend a lot of money just to convert it to a John Deere or Kinsey style. I know that's not the answer they probably want to hear, but truthfully, it's.
One thing I might add to that, Sean, in terms of our planting depth studies, if you're going to be aggressive on the closing wheels, don't be afraid of putting the seed in just a little bit deeper. You know, we talk about planting 2 inches deep. Our studies should say there's very little risk in most situations to go in a bit deeper, 2 1/4, 2 1/2. And so if you want to be aggressive at the back end with well, spiked or small spiked or whatever term you want to use for your closing wheels, just get the seed in a little bit deeper to prevent some of that disturbance that might be coming out of your aggressive closing wheels.
I totally agree with that. And we haven't really seen a big issue with the small knob, we'll call them knobs for lack of a better word. Never seen a problem with a curve tine type spike. Only have seen the problems major with those longer spikes, and I'm not sure even that's going to do what you want. The other thing is, I've seen some closing wheels, especially in clay, where I wouldn't want to have them because by the next day you wouldn't have a stitch of moisture left. Like they just didn't firm the soil up enough. They looked great when you watched them, but when you dug the soil up, it was in loose conditions, and we all know what happens on an 80-degree day with wind conditions in clay when you don't firm that back up.
Right on.
Just a quick note, we're coming up the top of the hour here, so we're going to keep answering questions for those of you that have them. And if you have to leave, we just want to thank you for joining our session today. I mentioned the seed right information that's available through your Mazek Seeds dealer in terms of setting your air pressure and brush meter. And if you have not received a copy yet of our agronomy summary, that Greg Stewart and the team puts together that summarizes all of our research from the previous year. Ask your Maizex Seeds dealer or check on our website, maizex.com. With that, I've got some more questions here. Sean, this is one of the questions that I think we all ask ourselves every year when we're planting, and especially when the weather sometimes is threatening at some of those days. What is there an ideal planting speed, or what? How can you determine the ideal speed for your planter?
Number one way to, and this is going to be a two-part answer, because we're finding that if you invest in a monitor with skips and doubles, it will tell you exactly what you need to know for your speed. You still got to go out and check the conditions in the ground afterwards, but your speed will, when you have a monitor, whether you have finger pickups, whether you have vacuum, whether you have whatever, I've seen it where a gentleman's not happy with the performance of the planter. He's going 5.5. He slows down to 5.4, no difference. Slows down to 5.3, no difference. Went to 5.2. The planter just came right to it. The meters all brightened up. That was just the sweet spot. We sped back up a little bit. I was actually in the cab in this particular case. We sped back up a little bit. It went right away again, went right back to 5.2. There's not a big difference between 5.5 and 5.2, but if you have the information there, it tells you, you know, what you can do. And again, if you've got rain coming and you're willing to sacrifice it a little bit at the 5.5 or at the 6, at least you see the exact result you're getting. It used to be, if you wanted to invest in a monitor to tell you those things that had skips and doubles, you had to spend $5,000 or $6,000. Not anymore. You can buy one literally for $1,200 to $2,000, and it's going to tell you a lot more information. If you don't have that capability, 5 mile an hour, if you're a finger pickup, they were never made to go above a certain RPM. They were only made to be in that 60 to 75 RPM. I've seen customers where they're wanting such a high population and a wider row width that they're actually spinning them over 100. And they were not made for that. You will not get a good plant no matter what you do. So if you're using a finger pickup, you cannot spin them faster than that 75. That's about the cutoff. And if you try it, you're just fooling yourself. And that's, again, a good tester will tell you that. Not everybody will, but if you go and get those tested, they will tell you that. So across the board, pretty well in 30-inch rows, 5 mile an hour is a pretty good speed if you're really trying to be careful.
Question here, how much graphite per unit of corn seed should I be using in a precision vac meter? That comes from Jim.
My standard for almost any meter is 2 tablespoons per bag of seed. I know that's not what the manufacturers say, and I brought that up to one of the major manufacturers a couple of years ago, that their recommendation in their manuals was pretty low, and they admitted that. And they said they just never got around to changing every single manual out there. But I didn't think that was the best answer in the world. But I recommend 2 tablespoons per bag of seed pretty well, no matter what meter you're running.
Okay, and that's depending on graphite or any comments on fluency agent?
Oh, I'm not a fan of fluency. Especially if you own a friction meter, you should not be using it in a finger pickup, should not be using it in a brush meter, because they need the lubrication from the graphite. And there is no reason, you don't even have a fan, but there has been a lot of cases where people have ruined those. Certain vacuum meters are friction type. They should not be using fluency. Switch back away from neonics and go back to graphite. All you're doing is prematurely wearing that meter out. We've seen it time and time again. Not a fan, sorry.
Hey, Sean, I don't want to jinx us about dry conditions this spring, but you know, we often get into situations where one of the number one complaints is I can't get the planter in the ground. And you know, I look outside and I get maybe a little bit nervous that this could be one of those springs where we have a lot of dry conditions. Want to just give us your top 1 or 2 tips about trying to diagnose a planter where the grower's on the phone with you and he says, wow, I just cannot get this thing to go, you know, Stuart tells me to plant 2.5 inches deep. I can't get it there. What's some of your comments on diagnosing planters that won't give you the depth?
Typically, we see it more in beans and in corn. Tends to be no-tilled more or minimum tilled more, and on a lot of these planters, we have more row units pushing that planter up. Lots of times it's improper down pressure adjustment. If you adjust at any time, I don't care what make of planter it is, I don't care what you're planting or in what conditions, if you adjust the depth and it doesn't respond, you don't have proper down pressure. So figure out why. A lot of times, a typical case is a guy buys a big 40-foot planter that weighs, it's huge, and he's just blown away by how big and heavy it is, and he goes out and he's got 32 rows on it, and he starts trying to plant down in Wheatley on that hard clay, and it's been dry for a few days, and he can't figure out that won't go in the ground. Well, if you have 400-pound springs on it and you have 32 rows, there's no way that planter weighs that much. If you go 32 times 400, I believe that's 12,800 pounds or right around that. Well, that frame doesn't weigh 5 ton. So somebody's got to put 5 ton on that planter if you need 400 pounds per row in order to get that row unit in the ground. So you have to start adding weight. Anytime you have to start adding weight in those conditions, I recommend you use the tanks that are there. So if you've got liquid tanks there, fill them up. If you don't have anything, water is a great thing. It's been my experience that people will never pull a cast weight off a planter ever. But if you have tanks where you can dump the water out in 5 minutes in the morning, when you got that 0.2 of an inch of rain overnight, then that's pretty easy. And everybody's got a water source now, so it's easy to put the water back in when it turns dry. But if you, as a general rule, if you're not responding to your depth and you get off and all your gauge wheels are loose, you either don't have the springs or the bags or the hydraulics set deep enough or heavy enough with enough pressure, or you don't have enough physical weight on the planter. And once you set that row unit more aggressive, if it's still not going in the ground the proper depth, then it's a weight issue usually.
Coulters up or coulters down in those situations, Sean? Would you raise the coulters up if your row unit was not going in the ground?
I do whatever it takes to get it planted, but just know this, I've seen lots of row units that broke the bottom of them off because the person was running either really bad coulters out front because they thought it went in better, or no, they took the coulters off. And you'd be surprised how many times those 2 blades leave the row unit when you're in conditions that hard. And for those people out there that have never seen that hard a condition, I had one gentleman broke 6 off in 1 year, and at $400 a pop, that starts to get a little bit expensive. So I have been told lots of times that taking the coulter off really improves it, but from a point of view of being hard on the planter, just know what you could end up with. In those cases, I would rather see you go to almost a straight blade just to assist that row. But yeah, you wouldn't be the first person that broke the bottom off your row unit. It
right
works.
I just had a follow-up question on the graphite, and so you would recommend the same in soybeans would be the 2 tablespoons of graphite as well for the brush meter?
Yeah. And there's certain makes out there that don't need the graphite. John Deere is one of them. But most of the makes are going to the graphite for lubricant. And I made a statement before about using graphite in a seed drill. If you're one of those people that gets tired of watching let's say a 17 or a 70, 750 drill or a 1790 or any of the seed drills with the open cups, how they'll flick the seed, you'll actually reduce that using graphite in there, and you'll get a better, more even plant on your controlled spillage type meters. But so I am a big fan of graphite. I find it just helps even everything up and pretty well everything.
Comment on being hard. The best is a year when we were trying to till the ground up before planting, and the cultivator was just riding on the top of the ground. So that would probably come under the definition of hard. We didn't touch on Sean at all yet, but what about maintenance on our dry or liquid fertilizer systems before we plant? What should we be doing in those situations?
Liquid fertilizer is a really good one. Make sure if you service those pumps, change the oil every single year. And I know people will say, oh, that's just ludicrous. Well, that's your only filtering mechanism in those pumps, whether it be a diaphragm or a cast piston pump. Dump that oil out. It's only a little bit of oil. Make sure you're using the proper oil. You should not be using detergent oil in those pumps. Make sure you're using the proper weight, but dump that oil every single year. I've seen tons of those, you know, $3,000, $4,000 cast piston pumps where you pop the screw out to let the oil out and there's nothing there, and what is there looks like tar. So that's a big maintenance item on them. All the good pumps are very expensive, whether they're diaphragm or piston. There's a lot of places around that test them, that can actually run them. If you're having problems, service them and run them. If you're not that person that wants to put a diaphragm kit in or replace the valves in a piston pump, go to a place that will do it. There are places that test run them. They've got them on hydraulic systems and they can sit there and run them for a period of time. Big fan of taking and making sure that you clean everything out, the filters. Nothing more frustrating than asking a customer 10 times before you go to a service call, did you clean the filter? And you get there and all the lines are sucked right in, and you'll take the filter out and it hasn't been cleaned for 3 years. So, and know that you can grow overnight. Like, so what that means is if you have a reaction in that system, you maybe have to clean that system out every single day for 4 or 5 days. If the crystallization is occurring because of contamination, you could run into that problem, but make sure you've cleaned everything out ahead of time. There are makes of fertilizer out there that you don't have to worry about in winter, and we see a reduced issue with them. If you're going to add something to your liquid fertilizer, know whether or not it's going to go bad. There's nothing worse than 200 gallons of pudding, because we have seen where a 200-gallon tank turned to solid pudding. But definitely go over everything, check your lines. If you're running liquid fertilizer in furrow, as soon as you kink one of those liquid fertilizer lines for in furrow, it should be replaced, because eventually once it's kinked, it's going to leak. Check all your other lines, check your fills. It's very common for people to blow a line off the first day and not understand why. Well, did you have that apart? Did you double check your clamps? You know, that kind of stuff. Dry fertilizer, definitely make sure your augers are in the right way. You know, I was at a clinic, I did a clinic a few years ago, and a fella told me that he owned his planter for 10 years and he never paid attention to which way the augers went in, and they were never backwards. And I said, you must be that guy that pulls them out, lays them on the ground, puts them right back in the same way. And he said, of course. So I'd say after 10 years, he got pretty lucky. So rotate the planter if you can, like rotate the drive and double check the rotation on those augers if you're going to do that. Do you have the right auger? Lots of times we see that person changes rates for some reason in a field, but didn't think to check the planter whether that auger was capable of those rates, whether it be high or low. And then they call and say, well, you know, my agronomist said that they don't want more than 100 pounds in that field because I've got chicken manure on it, but they can't get down to 100 pounds. So know all that ahead of time. Just makes your life a lot better in the spring. But they're definitely ripped drop tubes in dry fertilizer, see it all the time, that kind of stuff. Like, check it over ahead of time. The whole planter should be checked from top to bottom.
Along that vein, if you're using 28 in your banding on the planter, what's your banding with 28%? What's your best tips on winterization? Just leave the 28 in there. Should we be using antifreeze in those lines? What's your thought there?
Get rid of the 28, wash it out multiple times. Don't just wash it out once, but you got to get that 28 out of there. Rinse the whole system out, pump it through the lines, get it all out, and then use RV antifreeze. It's really the only true way to do it properly. You can't have any. I've had lots of customers tell me that they left the 28 in, and sometimes they get away with it, but most years they do not.
Greg, you had a comment?
Just moving along here in the discussion, I didn't want the show to end before I got my favorite question in, which is, I've got a fairly bare bones planter. What is Sean Dilliott's first planter upgrade, attachment, gizmo that he's going to add to that planter? Let's pretend the budget is unlimited, right? If you've got a relatively bare bones planter, what's the first attachment you add to that planter?
If it's an old planter, the number one thing you're going to be surprised would be a depth-o-matic. So if you've got an old Kinsey 2000 or John Deere 7000 and it doesn't have a rocker where your gauge wheels are,
yep,
you'll do far more with that $45 depth-o-matic than you will with spending $40,000 on a bunch of attachments. I'll tell you that right now. It's the number one thing. Would you not agree, Steve?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah, but if you have that,
let's move up to a slightly more modern planter that still doesn't have many bells and whistles on it.
All right, hydraulic down pressure.
Okay.
No doubt.
I would agree with that, and I think the return is just as much, or maybe more so, even in soybeans and corn. So
I agree with that statement. Yeah.
Good.
What follow-up question when we were talking about graphite and talc? How much farm talc should you be using per bag? So if we're looking at an air planter and we're using talc, and should you be using the 80-20 blend or straight up talc? What's your comments on that on a vacuum system?
Again, matters the make. They're all different. We'll use just a standard central fill planter with precision vacuum meters in it. Then use the 80-20. That's what they recommend. Again, I would go with I would always go with the 2 tablespoons per bag. So on a central fill, that's about 1 liter per tub on most makes. I find that the person that calls me and says they use lots on a central fill and they're having problems, they're probably not using lots. And if you own central fills, it's up to you to make sure you're not having any leaks on your system, because if you're leaking out of your lid or you're leaking elsewhere, that's going to affect it too. But if you're using Deere, the talc you want to use probably between 1 and 2 tablespoons per unit of seed. Most of the other makes, the 80-20 will get you by. I prefer to be able to, if it's a system where they want graphite and only use the talc as necessary, I prefer to use the graphite and only add the talc that I need. So a lot of times if you're using 2 tablespoons per bag of seed or per unit that you're putting in, try 1 tablespoon of talc first. Don't ever take the graphite away on those planters such as Precision or International Vacuum or Kinsey Vacuum. Don't take the graphite away, and definitely not on a brush meter. So many times I hear people say, well, I just use talc on a brush meter. I'm here to tell you, I don't care who told you that. Whether they're a dealer or not, they're wrong. You use graphite and only graphite to start with, and talc is to get rid of moisture. It's to get rid of problems in your seed. Okay.
What any comments on 750 drills to get them ready?
Yeah, just check them over, make sure your boots are good, make sure your blades are good, make sure your leaf springs between your boot and your blade is there a lot, because when they break, they disappear. Check your springs on your firming wheel and your closing wheel. There's a lot of attachments you can buy for a 750 or any no-till drill. Some of them work really well. But if you've got liquid fertilizer on it, really be diligent to make sure that it's going to clear everything down there. There's a lot of action going around, especially if you've just put a system on it. But biggest thing we see in no-till drills is war blades and war boots. And I don't care what make it is. You know, they don't last forever. You got to remember when you're no-tilling, you're doing the job of a plow and a cultivator and everything tied in together. So you're going to wear.
What, just want to circle back for a minute. So question is, down pressure was your first investment. What would be your second one?
Vacuum. If you don't have vacuum, every single planter out there can be retrofitted for vacuum. I have a saying, mechanical meters plant good in ideal conditions, vacuum meters plant good in all conditions. Once soybean season starts, I get a lot of phone calls on mechanical meters, and I don't get any on vacuums in soybeans. Think about it, you're putting a round object in a round hole, and it works pretty good. But yeah, I definitely am a fan of vacuum meters. So.
Question on a white planter. So from Bruce, he has a 25-year-old white 6100 corn planter. He's always had that in the flow position, but is this right or wrong for that planter?
What like how many rows?
I don't have that.
If it's a smaller one, he's probably fine in the float because you know, it's not a real heavy planter to begin with. If he's using it in no-till, again, it would depend on the actual individual planter. The book should tell you some of those were fairly small and fairly light. It's not going to hurt them to be in float. They're probably in tilled ground, that type of thing.
6 rows, so.
6 rows? Now you're making me really think back to the hydraulic system on that. I think he's better off. I truly think he's better off to lower the planter down. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there's 4 cylinders on that planter, wheel cylinders, and I believe he's not supposed to be putting it in float. Anytime you have a phasing system, it is not to be put in float. And somebody is going to come in and say, well, a John Deere 7000 is a phasing system. No, it's not. It's a closed system. The only way you can phase it is to take the collar off and phase it that way. So it's a totally different system. It's a one-way system too, by the way. There's only one lift hose on a John Deere 7000 modular style planter. So if you have 2 hoses and it's a phasing system, don't put it in float. General statement.
Very good. Any comments from yourself, Greg?
No, I'm taking notes as to how to improve my planter performance this year.
On your seat, on your, you mentioned early on, you know, when we're checking over and wear parts and replacing things at the same time. When you've got your bottom scraper, you call it, or seed tube protector, some call it. You know, if you're getting more wear on that, is that just a question of not enough washers on the discs, or what's happening there?
No, depending on the conditions you're planning into, we do have customers. I've seen customers where they'll wear them out. They haven't wore the seed blade out, but that inside scraper is wore out prematurely. Probably it's making them money because if they're in really hard going, the angle of those seed blades make them want to shove in all the time. So they're just trying to crush that all the time. So they're definitely going to wear it faster. There are, for most makes, there are harder ones out there. Sometimes they're really expensive. Sometimes they're not too bad. Every time you make something harder, the piece that wasn't wearing could possibly start to wear now. So just think of it like a wear item again in heavy going. If your pinch is right, go with that. Don't sit there and widen it out because you're wearing that out. Because as soon as you do that, then you're affecting the V in the ground. And if you don't change that when you should, depending on the make, you will break the hook off the seed tube. It will come in, pinch the seed tube, and send it back. And I've had customers break as many as 31 out of 32 rows in one day, and did 19 one day and 31 rows the next day. You didn't change that scraper in there when you should have. Okay.
Very good. All right. Well, I think we've got all the questions answered, and so just want to thank Sean again for an excellent session, and Greg, and a great overview. My thought has always been is that the most important days of the year are actually the ones you spend on the planter to make sure things are right before you hit the field. So I think you reinforced that in a very good way today, Sean. So thanks very much. Thanks to everybody for joining us, and we wish everybody a very safe and productive spring. Hopefully the weather is cooperative so we can get everything in the ground in good shape, and we look forward to starting our new sessions coming up next year for agronomy going into the next season. So thanks again, everybody. Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Greg.